I want to tell you about a gap. Not a small one, not the kind you find when a courthouse burns down or a clerk misfiled something. A 20-year gap, a wall, the kind that stops genealogists cold when they try to trace American family lines between 1880 and 1900. You hit 1890 and there's nothing there. Not because people weren't documented, they were, every single one of them. Then the documentation ceased to exist. On June 1st, 1890, the United States government did something it had never done before at that scale. It didn't just count people, it photographed them in words. Nearly 63 million Americans were recorded not as names on a list, but as households, individual family portraits in data, who lived with whom, what they did for work, whether they owned their home or rented it, whether they could read, whether they had disabilities, how many children a woman had carried, and how many of those children were still breathing. For immigrants, the questions went even deeper. How long have you been here? Have you filed for citizenship? Are you naturalized or still an alien? What language do you speak at home? For the first time in American history, they used punch card tabulation technology, the direct ancestor of what would eventually become IBM's computing systems. This wasn't a head count, it was a systematic technological inventory of an entire nation, and the timing of it made it irreplaceable. 1890 was the year the American frontier was officially declared closed. Frederick Jackson Turner, one of the most influential historians in American history, built his entire thesis about American national identity on that declaration. 3 cities crossed 1 million residents for the first time. Chicago became the second largest city in the country. Foreign-born residents made up nearly 15% of the population, the highest proportion the country had ever recorded. Ellis Island opened 18 months later. That detail matters enormously. The 1890 census captured America in the final moment before mass immigration through official processing channels began. It recorded who was already here, where they had come from, how long they had been present, and whether they had become citizens. It was the baseline, the before picture, the record of the old America, taken just before the new one started arriving. January 10th, 1921, late afternoon, a James Foster named building fireman noticed smoke seeping through pipe openings in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. Not flames, smoke. He reported it. Fire departments arrived quickly. They chopped holes in the floor, flooded the basement with 20 streams of water, and by 9:45 that evening, the fire was out. Then everyone went home. No emergency salvage operation, no urgent effort to recover waterlogged records. The chief clerk opened some windows to clear the smoke, watchmen continued their patrols, and the building emptied out for the night. The records sat in ankle-deep water until morning. Here is the detail that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. The 1890 census contained a fireproof vault. The 1880 census was inside it. The 1910 census was inside it. The 1890 census, the most detailed population record ever assembled in American history up to that point, was stacked on pine shelves in an unlocked file room, right next to the boiler room, adjacent to a carpenter's shop full of sawdust and wood shavings. The National Archives' own description of what happened says the 1890 records were, quote, first in the path of the firemen. First in the path.
Now here is where the story shifts from tragedy to something harder to explain. Damage assessments after the fire varied, but at least one documented source reported that approximately 38% of the 1890 census records survived, undamaged. That's nearly 24 million individual records that could have been recovered, transcribed, photographed, preserved. For 12 years, historians and genealogists tried to make that happen. The National Genealogical Society petitioned Congress. The Daughters of the American Revolution formally protested. Letters were written, appeals were made, assurances were given. No destruction was planned, they were told. The records would be protected. For 12 years, that promise held, technically. Then, in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Census Bureau quietly submitted a list of records deemed no longer necessary for current business. Item 22 on that list read, Population 1890 Original. The Librarian of Congress was asked to flag anything historically significant worth keeping. He flagged nothing. On February 20, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone of the National Archives building, the institution created specifically to preserve American historical records for future generations. On February 21, 1933, Congress authorized the destruction of the 1890 census. One day. A handwritten note found later in a Census Bureau file reads, Remaining schedules destroyed by Department of Commerce in 1934. Then, in parentheses, 4 words that suggest someone inside the building understood exactly what was happening. Not approved by the geographer. Someone objected. It didn't matter. I want to be fair here. Government bureaucracies lose things. Incompetence is well documented across every era of American history. Water damage to paper records in the 1920s presented genuine preservation challenges. These are real factors, and dismissing them entirely would be intellectually dishonest. But they don't explain everything. They don't explain why the 1890 census specifically was stored outside the fireproof vault when every other census year around it was stored inside. They don't explain why no immediate salvage efforts were made on the night of the fire when a significant portion was reportedly undamaged. They don't explain why 12 years of formal appeals from credentialed institutions were met with reassurances that turned out to be false. They don't explain the one-day gap between the laying of the National Archives cornerstone and the authorization of destruction. And they don't explain the handwritten note, the quiet parenthetical objection from someone inside the system whose name we don't even know. Someone knew it was wrong. Someone said so. And the records were destroyed anyway. Out of nearly 63 million documented Americans, 6,160 names survive today, fragments from 10 states and the District of Columbia. That's what remains of the most ambitious population record America had ever attempted. We lost the immigration status of 9.2 million foreign-born Americans. We lost naturalization timelines. We lost family structures. We lost Civil War service records that veterans' descendants can no longer verify. We lost the only federal snapshot of American life between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. We lost the before picture. And what strikes me, what I keep returning to, is the shape of the gap itself. It isn't random. It isn't scattered. It falls precisely across the decades when America was transforming most rapidly. When the frontier closed, when the cities exploded, when millions of people arrived through official channels for the first time, when the old patterns ended and the new ones began. The one record that would have told us exactly who was here during that transformation, where they came from, how long they had been present, whether they were citizens, that record no longer exists. Not lost, authorized for destruction, one day after the building meant to prevent exactly that was officially begun. The gap is shaped like an answer to a question someone didn't want asked. And the questions that remain are simple ones. Why was 1890 outside the vault? Who decided 12 years of preservation appeals didn't matter? What was in those 24 million surviving records that made destruction preferable to saving them? And if nearly 63 million Americans can be erased from the historical record through what gets officially called negligence, what else might have been removed the same way?